All right. Hi, everybody. Good morning across California. It's good to be with you all. We're going to let people kind of stream in and get settled. It is our 37th meeting here at the Local Energy Resources Network, and I'm here with a couple other members of the California Climate and Energy Collaborative team. So Rochelle and Kelsey will both say hello over chat. You can always reach out to them if you have any needs during this meeting. I'm Angie Hacker. I'm your statewide best practices coordinator. And I wanted to say Happy New Year. It's kind of a crazy start to 2025 already, especially for those of us here in Southern California. I hope you're safe. And feeling like I am, ready to double down on our energy and climate work here to protect California communities. We're really honored to be joined by a couple of great speakers today. So if you caught our outreach, we wanted to have a timely conversation about the threats and solutions related to federal funding as we face a transition to the new federal administration. And so we're joined today by Minh Lee of LA County, who, as you all know, is very busy right now, but also a big expert, I think, in this way, because he's also worked in the federal government, and he's here to share some of the experience and advice and strategies he's using in LA County. We also have Rachel Jacobson of the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who's going to give us more of a federal landscape look and some insights from that vantage point. So let's go ahead and dive in. And as we do, I want to invite everybody to introduce yourself over chat. Tell us how you're doing, where you're from, who you are. It'll be nice to see you all. We're going to have a big year this year, 2025. It's going to be action-packed. All right, so as usual, we spend our interactive 1 hour together to create a regular space for local governments and those that work with them. And the idea is we help each other learn about available opportunities to advance your energy and climate goals. So it's a lot about funding and other types of assistance. And so, like I said, we're going to do our opportunity roundtable as usual, and there's kind of a lot going on, even in funding world still. Then we'll hear from Rachel and then Minh, and we'll have some discussion. I'd love to hear your thoughts on any of the concerns or strategies you're using with regard to federal funding. We'll do a little bit of an update on our SEEK forum. We'll close out, and if you can join us for the 15 minutes of our bonus breakout, that's our informal conversation, and you're free to bring up any topics that you would like to discuss, and we'll shut off the recording and do that. So that's what we've got in store for you today. Let's go ahead and jump in on our opportunity roundtable. So as always, we like to provide this crazy, colorful hyperlink cheat sheet, and you're going to get all of this afterwards, so don't worry too much about taking ferocious notes, although Rochelle and Kelsey will be providing links to everything we talk about in the chat. I'm going to just highlight the programs that are in mainly in yellow and talk through those because we haven't talked about them before. And so also here on the left, we usually talk about how policy drives investment. And of course, what's happening in LA and our fires right now is prompting some pretty quick turnaround on some new policy moves. So I linked to an article from Cal Matters there on the left on Newsom's actions with regard to wildfire response and recovery. Just Monday, he and Democratic lawmakers proposed earmarking $1 billion for wildfire relief and recovery in Southern California. And they're also talking about accelerating the availability of $1.5 billion out of the recently passed $10 billion climate bond to prepare the state for other natural disasters. So I think there's going to be some movement here on this theme around accelerating and streamlining funding for communities. And I hope we can kind of lean into that. There's a big need for it. So on to actual funding opportunities. I don't know, there was a lot to talk about this month. And if I didn't catch it all, as always, I want to encourage you to drop in the chat anything that you've heard from your end. What funding opportunities are you seeing? We got to help each other out this year and make the most of what exists. But I'm seeing what I think is a little bit, I don't want to call it death rows, but I think there's a lot coming out from the federal government trying to get out as quick as possible to make sure that it has a chance at sticking. And so let's talk about the Department of Transportation first. That's our first highlighted one. This one's called Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, so RAISE grant program. It's due January 30th, coming right up. There's $1.5 billion available nationwide to fund eligible surface transportation projects that will have a significant local or regional impact that advances the departmental priorities of safety, equity, climate, and sustainability. So it's trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the transportation sector, incorporate evidence-based climate resilience measures and features, and avoid adverse environmental impacts to air, water quality, wetlands, and endangered species. And so you're eligible, most of you are eligible. State, tribal, and local governments, special districts, and port authorities are eligible for this one. So if you're not the transportation person, this might be the one to pass along to that department. Again, due January 30th. Okay, and the ones that you see here in red, and I don't know, man, you might have more to say about this, but of all the federal funds out there, the DOEs and the EPA are the ones I'd be most worried about in terms of not actually getting awarded or even getting clawed back. So that's what I just put in red. It's sort of like proceed with caution on applying. Just know that there's some possibility there for change. Okay, the next one I wanted to mention is philanthropic. TFN, the Funders Network, has an opportunity they're calling Partners for Places Matching Grant Program. It's due on February 28th. You got a little time. It's in partnership with USDN, and it's providing partnership investments between $45,000 and $100,000 for one-year projects, or between $75,000 and $150,000 for two-year projects. And the idea is you're supposed to match with a local foundation at least 50%. So it's trying to, in order to be eligible, you need 3 partners: 1 local government sustainability or water director, 1 frontline community group, and 1 place-based funder. It's interesting. And so the purpose of it is to fund local equitable climate action or green stormwater infrastructure. And it's trying to advance opportunities for local government, frontline communities, and place-based funders to build trusting partnerships and develop projects together. I sort of like this one and think it might be interesting for some of you. Okay, USDA, another federal source. This one's called High Energy Cost Grants, and this will be one for I think those of you more in a rural area. Due February 28th, $10 million is available nationwide. Award amounts are between $100 and $3 million, and lots of folks are eligible, from private to higher education, small business, state governments, individuals, nonprofits, and public institutions. So local governments would be eligible as well, including special districts. Purpose of this one, it's competitive to assist with communities with extremely high energy costs, and the kinds of eligible activities they're talking about include acquiring, constructing, or improving energy generation, transmission, or distribution facilities serving communities where the average annual residential expenditure for home energy exceeds 275% of the national average. So you would want to do that calculation, and I haven't done it. But I wonder if California might be competitive here. You want to do that calculation before you apply. No, man, you say this one. He's shaking his head. No, we don't apply. We are not eligible. We're not that bad.
No, perhaps some areas, but you're looking at 44 cents. That's pretty darn high.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Oh, man, so helpful to have you here. Okay, let's go on to an interesting one called from the DOE. This one is Career Skills Training Program, and I really wanted to highlight this for those of you that are doing kind of bigger, maybe regional scale workforce development activities related to energy efficiency. So it's due March 6th. This one's one of those weirder ones. It's not a full, complex 97-page competitive application. This one's off of the Energy Works website. It looks a little bit more like an RFP. There's $6.8 million available nationwide. They're requesting applications from nonprofit partnerships between industry and labor organizations to provide students classroom instruction and on-the-job training to obtain industry-related certifications to install energy efficiency building technologies. And so they're trying to fund between 2 and 10 awards between $400,000 and $1.1 million. There's 2 work stream options that they're trying to use to strengthen the clean energy workforce. One is to expand existing training pathways, which some of you are really have mature workforce programs that might be a good candidate for these, or enhancing existing energy efficiency career skills. So, like I said, it's a workforce focus. If that's you and you have a nonprofit to apply under, that would be one for you. So it's due March 31st. I'm sorry, no, March 6th. Okay, keeping going. Like I said, there's kind of a lot happening right now. I have one here from the California Energy Commission, and this is going to be one of those for you guys who are working on infrastructure charging stations. So this is FAST 2.0, fast available charging for all Californians, due March 31st. Total funding amount available is $10 million. Maximum amount is 50% of the total project cost or $5 million, whichever is less. You can submit multiple applications, and so all public and private entities with a business presence in California can apply. And so the eligible activities on this one was to deploy fast electric vehicle charging infrastructure for the public. Eligible projects must be open to the public. Okay. I'm having a stall. I'm having internet issues a little bit here today. Let's find my way back. Okay. All right, so let's move on to the next one. This one is State Water Resources Control Board. It's one called Clean Water State Revolving Fund / Energy Audit. There's a few here that we're going to talk about that are on a rolling basis. I haven't decided if I like them if they tell you how much is left, but just be, usually on these ones earlier is better. There's $2 million available to fund audits that study water and/or energy to encourage public agencies to take an independent look into their current practices, identify potentially inefficient water or energy use, and follow up with a plan to improve consumption of these valuable resources. You're eligible if you're a nonprofit, public agency, or tribal government. And like I said, it's on a rolling basis. Here again, this one is really blew my mind. $1 billion available for the DOE's technical assistance for adoption of building energy codes. It's on a rolling basis. It's available to provide support in adopting, implementing, and enforcing the latest model zero energy codes or equivalent codes or standards, improving residential and commercial new construction and retrofits, and transitioning the building stock to more efficient, carbonized buildings for all. Some of you all are doing some pretty sophisticated code work. This one is eligible to both state and local governments with the authority to adopt building energy codes. I'm really interested here if there's some opportunity to work between the state and some of you regional folks on deploying this one across the state. So more to come perhaps on that. Last one I wanted to share with you as a funding opportunity. You guys probably know about SIEGE. This one is our Thriving Communities, the EPA grant for Thriving Communities. They have a subaward that they're releasing tomorrow, and it's another rolling grant, but it starts tomorrow. They're calling it the Thriving Communities Grant, and it's talking about social and environmental entrepreneurs and other grant-making teams around the country will distribute $48 million in funding through EPA Region 9 to nonprofits, local governments, grassroots organizations, Native, Indigenous, rural, border, and urban communities, tackling unsafe housing, pollution, lack of access to clean water, reducing extreme heat, and more. So that one, there's a webinar that was recorded yesterday. I think you could access, and you would be able to receive up to $150,000 to $350,000 to access the resources your community needs to solve problems, build resilience, and create healthy neighborhoods. So those are the funding opportunities I'm aware of. If you know of others, I would love to hear it. Throw it in the chat. Let's help each other out. These blue ones that I've highlighted here, we're going to talk about in our next segment where we're talking about resources and strategies for how we transition into this new federal administration and what does it mean for us all when it comes to funding. So EPA and Lawyers for Good Government have some great resources and services. Our next speaker is actually going to talk a little bit more about those, so I don't have to. All right, so with that, thanks for listening to the fire hose. I'm going to move on to the meat of our conversation, which again, we're going to have this great conversation. Obviously, we're in 2025. We're pretty close to inauguration. We're about to have the new Trump administration. We're starting to see some changes already happening in the agencies that have given us pretty good 4 years of funding. And we wanted to have this timely conversation for those of you who may have already been awarded federal funds or maybe looking to apply for more federal funds about what can we expect and what can we do to protect ourselves and not waste our time. So we have been very honored to have a couple people present for us. And I'm going to first start with Rachel, and then we'll go to Minh next, and then we'll have Q&A. So Rachel Jacobson, I know through ASAP, and she's fantastic. And she is the lead researcher of state climate policy on the state fiscal policy team, where she leads the center's work to direct the benefits of federal climate tax credits, loans, and grants to low-income communities and communities of color, and guides advocates to influence state climate change policies and investments. So thanks so much for being with us, Rachel. We're going to turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Angie. It's great to be with you all. Like Angie, I just want to make sure folks in LA know that our hearts are with you all. And I have close family in LA as well, although I am based in Michigan. So thinking of you and hope that you're all staying safe. Let's go to the next slide. And I'll just give a breakdown of the agenda for my talk. So, as we know, the incoming Trump administration and congressional Republicans have made clear their intentions to cut climate funding, but it's not clear where that lands in their overall priorities for action or which funding they will target first. So with all of those unknowns, the purpose of this presentation is to help you get clarity on what the threats are, so you know what to focus on and when. So first, we're sort of break down the threat elements, make sure we're all on the same page about what these threats even are. And then we'll talk specifically about understanding and responding to threats to grant and loan programs, and then understanding and responding to threats to tax credits, because those mechanisms are a bit different across those two types of programs. And then we'll just finish up with some key points and additional resources. Next slide. All right, so here at Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, we advance federal and state policies to help build a nation where everyone, regardless of income, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, identity, zip code, immigration status, or disability status, has the resources they need to thrive and share in the nation's prosperity. And we do that through policy research and advocacy at the federal and state levels, primarily tax and budget policy. Our climate policy work is focused right now on IRA defense and supporting a cohort of state fiscal policy organizations to advance just and equitable climate spending through IRA implementation in their states, as well as leverage state climate policy to raise progressive state and local revenues, bring long-term sustainability to state budgets, bring democracy and community autonomy to the energy system, and center vulnerable populations in climate adaptation. And I just wanted to mention, although they're not in our climate cohort specifically, we do have the California Budget and Policy Center as one of our affiliate groups that we have in 40 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. Next slide. All right, so we're going to break down the threat elements in this, which is our intro section. And so this will give you the grounding to understand the specific threats that we'll discuss later on. Next slide. So there are three elements to understand. One element is the legal and political mechanisms. So these mechanisms determine when the threat could emerge and what the response is. The second element to understand is the level of priority. This will influence how likely it is that a particular mechanism may be activated for a given climate funding program and when. And then third, we have to know whether the funding has been obligated. This applies specifically to grants and loans, because whether the funding has been obligated will determine which mechanisms are relevant. Let me just pause. Are folks seeing? I'm seeing the slides. Okay, great. Next slide. All right, so let's start here with that first element, legal and political mechanisms. So we have congressional mechanisms and we have administrative mechanisms. With respect to congressional mechanisms, so first is legislation. Congress could use legislation to repeal or change funding programs and tax credits. The legislative vehicles for repealing or modifying climate programs are only going to be our must-pass vehicles. I won't totally get into this, but otherwise they'll need 60 votes in the Senate, which they won't get. We'll talk about in a minute what those must-pass vehicles are. But just know that when we say legislation, we don't mean any legislation. There have been bills introduced where the whole purpose of the bill, there's a bill right now where the whole purpose of the bill is to get rid of the community change program. That bill is not, I mean, I don't want to say, look, never say never, but like that bill is extremely unlikely to pass. And then the second congressional mechanism is the Congressional Review Act. So Congress could use their Congressional Review Act powers to nullify recently submitted administrative rules. And for our purposes, this is going to be relevant to tax credits, and I'll explain that in just a bit. And then for administrative mechanisms, those could be activated through an executive order from the president or by heads of individual agencies. And so those, so when you see actually like the last three on the list on the right-hand side for administrative, so slowing down contracting or reimbursement processes, terminating contracts, weaponizing audits, like, you know, that those are mechanisms that either could come from an executive order or like an individual agency could decide that they want to, you know, slow down contracting processes. Impoundment, that is withholding or reprogramming funds. Yeah, we'll get into that a little bit, but that's what it means. Impoundment is withholding or reprogramming funds. And I just want to emphasize these are mechanisms that could be used. We do not know whether or to what extent they will be used. All right, next slide. Okay, so as I mentioned, that I think it was second element was knowing what the priorities are. There are lots of things we don't know, but here are some things that we do know. We do know that Republicans have an intention to renew the 2017 tax cuts and that there are questions around whether they'll want to pay for them or not. We also know that there, in general, is a preference for fossil energy over clean energy within the Republican Party. And the implications of these two things together are that Republicans may target any or all clean energy funding in a budget reconciliation bill. So just know that, you know, so next we're going to talk about a budget reconciliation bill, and know this is why we're going to be talking about a budget reconciliation bill. It's because we know about these two things. We also know that there's been a lot of criticism of electric vehicle incentives. And because of that, we have a pretty strong indication that electric vehicle tax credits are considered one of the parts of the IRA that is most vulnerable to repeal. We have also gotten a lot of, I want to say signals, but it's really just direct speaking about criticism of federal funding going to nonprofits. And so there are two big implications of that. So one is that community change grants and other grant programs that are designed for nonprofits or that have nonprofit awardees may be more vulnerable to any of these threats that are relevant to those types of programs. And also that the direct pay provision, which is the provision that allows for tax-exempt entities to take advantage of tax credits in the IRA, that direct pay provision may also be more vulnerable to repeal than other IRA tax provisions because it allows nonprofits to take advantage of the tax credits. And then lastly, we also know that there's been pressure from Republican districts to maintain IRA tax incentives that are benefiting those places. The biggest example of this is what's known as the Garbarino letter, and a set of Republicans that basically stated their support primarily for manufacturing tax credits, but also to some extent clean energy tax credits. And so that's how we know that tax credits, or why we believe that tax credits for clean energy and clean vehicle manufacturing may be less vulnerable to repeal. Okay, let me stop there because I know that's kind of a lot. Are there any like clarifying questions on that piece before we move on? All right. Next slide. Okay, So this is, based on the two things that I just shared, like what are the available mechanisms? What do we know about potential priorities? And knowing what we do about other things that the government needs to get done, we can put together this emerging timeline for potential legislative and administrative action. Emphasis on emerging and potential. So we can expect to see a lot of administrative action right at the beginning of the presidential administration change. But administrative action can really happen at any time. But often there's like the first 100 days push and we can expect the potential for many executive orders and other agency actions within that time frame. And then also, in these early months, we expect that we will see a budget resolution, which will set up our reconciliation process. And actually, let me back up. So, although there are a lot of unknowns about the priorities and timeline for congressional action, what we do know is that climate funding cuts are very likely to happen as provisions in budget reconciliation because it doesn't require getting 60 votes in the Senate, or in must-pass legislation that Congress knows they'll have to put in the political energy for. So here is what we know about the timeline for those things. So we could see a budget reconciliation bill as early as February. Prior to the bill, we'll see the budget resolution, which could give us some hints into what types of provisions might be targeted in the bill. I'm actually seeing that I'm like getting close to the end of my time. So I'm gonna leave this timeline slide. Just know that if you have questions about when we might see legislative or administrative action, we can come back to those questions. And I'm going to move us forward to the next slide. Yeah, I think okay. There we go. Next one after that. Great. Okay. So we're going to talk about grants and loans next. And grant and loan funding faces various threats depending on its stage of implementation. We'll go through those threats in detail on the next slide, but for now, let's make sure we're all on the same page about the stages of implementation. Okay, so the IRA and IIJA created mandatory spending, but many of those programs have unspent appropriations. So appropriated funding is something that could be at risk, and we'll talk about why that's important for local governments in a second. And then many programs have award announcements, or awardees have received award notifications, but that only means that a grantee has been selected. The last stage, which is when funds are obligated, only happens when there's a written record of the funding commitment. And so that is, for example, a signed contract or award agreement. So these are the different stages, and the threats differ based on what stage you are in. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now that we have an understanding of those phases, let's go through the threats. For unspent appropriations, the big question for local governments is, should you apply for programs that have open NOFOs? And should you expect additional NOFOs to open up for programs that have appropriations that haven't been spent yet? Those programs could get repealed through the legislative mechanisms that we just talked about. Well, we didn't talk about them in depth, but budget reconciliation being the biggest one, or the administration could impound the funds. They could decide not to spend the funds. That is technically illegal, but they might decide to do it anyway. It could get caught up in court, and that would be on a timeline that would be totally irrelevant to a local government. With all of that in mind, we recommend monitoring the political signals to the best you can, and focus, if you are going to submit an application for one of these NOFOs, to focus on what I'm calling shovel-ready applications. So applications where you already have the project concept, maybe you're looking for funding in other places also, you can get an application out the door quickly without too much effort on your part. Awarded and obligated funds are both subject to slowing down of contracting and reimbursement processes. Luckily, there are excellent technical assistance providers out there who can support you in responding to those threats. Angie alluded to them previously. I'm going to put a link in the chat to the most recent blast from Environmental Protection Network, which includes it includes several resources from EPN, as well as a link to sign up to Lawyers for Good Government's funding legal protection clinic. I'm sure I'm getting the name of that wrong. But if you are an awardee and you want to get specific technical assistance for your award, those are two great resources for that. For obligated funds, same thing. You'll want to seek technical assistance on actions you can take to potentially harden your award agreements further and get ready to respond to any of these threats. Before I move on from this slide, weaponizing audits is something that's listed on here. I just want to be clear that we haven't actually heard of anyone planning to weaponize audits, but it is something that could happen. Okay, next slide. And Angie, I know I'm going over time here, so I will try to wrap up in the next minute or two. I wanted to provide, we won't go over this in depth, but I just wanted to provide an explanation of the status of some key programs that folks in this room might either be awardees of or be concerned about. So you can review the slide later, and then you can match that to the recommendation based on the implementation status. And I'll also put in the chat, so we put together a spreadsheet that helps folks understand the status of key programs. Now, key programs for us might be a little different than key programs for you. For our network, it's grant programs with implications for environmental justice and or that are administered by the state. And you'll see, you know, programs that have a significant amount of appropriations that are unspent, for example, in this list, as well as, and then just like key, like you'll be able to look up the status for programs that kind of meet that criteria, but it might not cover everything you're interested in. Okay, next slide. And next slide again. Okay, so tax credits. This is the threats to tax credits are a little bit different. I think it's really important to note that just the threat of uncertainty, both with grants and loans and with tax credits, it's creating this uncertainty, especially with tax credits for potential filers, is making it much less likely that people will take advantage of them. And will, I think, like, you know, we are encouraging folks to continue using tax credits, especially through 2025. And I'll explain why. And I hope that you, after this presentation, will feel like you can do that as well. Okay, so 6 particularly important provisions for clean energy priorities in disadvantaged communities. So if you're newer to the tax credit side of the IRA, I just wanted to point these out. And if you're still kind of wrapping your head around which tax credits to pay attention to, this is my recommendation. These are the things we're paying attention to. So that's, again, I won't go over these in depth because we got to get to the end here, but you can go back here in the slide. All right, next slide. Okay, so there are 3 main threats to tax credits. We've got the Congressional Review Act, and this allows Congress to nullify rules that were submitted after a certain time period. Don't need to get into the details of that, but the implications are that that absence of final rules for a tax credit can really dissuade filers from using the program. Rules could be changed to make programs less effective or less accessible. And then I note here some key programs from the previous slide that have rules that are vulnerable to Congressional Review Act. Congress could, the same way that they could repeal grant and loan programs through a legislative vehicle, most likely budget reconciliation. They could also do that to tax credits. But it's important to note that we believe that it's unlikely that they will repeal tax credits wholesale, perhaps with the exception of the clean vehicle credits. They are more likely to, for example, put a cap. Almost all of the IRA tax credits are uncapped. They could put a cap on them. They could decrease the number of years that the tax credits are available. There are lots of other ways, and this gets back to their desire to potentially pay for an extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. But if you take away nothing, just know that that it is unlikely that Congress will make changes that go into effect sooner than tax year 2026. And because of that, we recommend as many projects as possible to get underway in tax year 2025, because there is an extremely high likelihood that those credits, that filers will still be able to claim the credits. Okay. So that is it for my content. I just want to go to the very last slide, which is additional resources. One more, yep. And I will put these in the chat. And yep, look forward to your questions.
Rachel, that was awesome. We clearly need more time for that content. I want to encourage people to put your questions for Rachel in the chat. She can start addressing those as we move on to our next speaker, Minh. So Minh Lee serves as the General Manager for Energy and Environmental Services for LA County's Internal Services Department. Like he said, he's got federal experience as well. So we're excited to hear more from what you all are doing to prepare. Thanks, Minh.
Thank you, and thanks, Rachel, for the briefing there. I want to share with you some perspective, not just from my service here at the local government, but also from the federal service. But also, I was in DC just last month, and Sacramento as well, and Texas last week, talking with current and former administration officials from both parties. And so some of the thoughts that I'm going to share with you, is amalgamation of a lot of different briefings and a lot of different discussions I've had over the past several months. And the lens I'm trying to frame it here is, how do our communities continue to make climate progress, with the support of federal assistance with this incoming administration. And there's definitely not all doom and gloom. And so I want to share that. So next slide, please. So actually, before I talk about all that, I just want to remind people that, in 2023, I think it was, the wildfires in Canada actually caused more emissions than many industrialized nations. Okay, so wildfires actually release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, and certainly the wildfires down here in LA, though not nearly as large as the ones that burned in Canada in 2023. Will certainly make a dent, negatively make a dent in our progress, towards, lower emissions from the state of California. Going back to the content at hand here, elections do have consequences. The incoming administration, does believe that they have a mandate to make some significant changes. And, from the way our politics work, we now have a single party that controls marginally the House, the Senate, as well as they have a conservative court supporting them as well. In any normal change of parties and administration change, we should expect changes. Okay, Democrats certainly expect those changes to happen in a turnover, and so I think Republicans expect those changes as well. Priorities of agencies will shift. Okay, that's for sure going to happen. However, I actually personally don't believe, and many people I talk to don't believe that this will be a normal transition. Next slide, please. Let's look at the history of the first Trump administration and compare that to what we might see here in the incoming Trump administration, the next one. During the first Trump administration, clean energy actually continued to make significant progress. Even though President Trump pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Accord, the federal agencies actually continued to do their work, and agency funding, for the most part, did not change dramatically. I spoke with many different colleagues who served, both under President Obama, as well as President Trump, and as well as under President Biden. And when you look at the work of the agencies themselves, that continued. The lens at which the work gets done, certainly does change, and priorities do change. But the work actually, for the most part, is carried out by career civil servants, both at the GS level and the SES level. And a lot of that work continued regardless of which party controls the White House or Congress. Grants were awarded and funding made its way out of DC to all parts of the United States. Now, there were certainly some policy changes that President Trump and his administration they were driving that got hung up in the courts. And the reality was the clock ran out, towards the end of the administration, just as the clock is running out right now under President Biden. And so some of those policy changes never really took hold. This new incoming administration and the transition teams that they have are much more organized, and they have a Project 2025 playbook to work from. And so I do believe that there will be other changes that will be happening that will be very significant. Next slide, please. First and foremost is you got to think about the federal workforce, is the people that carry out the work of the agencies. Okay, the people that, if you have federal grants right now and you work with staff at EPA, at DOE, at DOT, whichever federal agency there is, you normally expect around a 6% attrition rate on an annual basis. In Washington, D.C., the federal workforce is always in flux. People come in and to DC to work in the federal government. They might not spend their entire career there. They may move back to local government, state government, private sector, etc., nonprofits. They don't spend their entire career there. So you normally expect some degree of turnover. What we're probably going to be seeing here in the first 2 years of new administration is I'm going to think that there's going to be a higher degree of attrition. In some parts of different agencies, you may see 10, 20% attrition. Okay. And that has implications to existing award programs that you may be working on. And that human capital side is extremely important, and you got to worry about that. There's a push towards, having more federal workforce back in the office. I do know that some federal agencies went to like 90% telework. Okay. When I visited Washington, D.C. in December and compare it to when I served, over a decade, a decade and a half earlier in D.C., the metro system was fairly empty. Okay. Rush hour, there are certainly people, in the subway system out and about. However, it was a lot less active. And you might see that in many urban areas as well. New York City, San Francisco, Chicago, etc. I was just in Austin last week, and certainly it wasn't that active. There's a lot of telework, and there's going to be a push to move people back into the office post-COVID. And that's going to drive some attrition out. Okay. And you got to remember that there's a new generation of workers as well. And some of the new generation of workers, actually, that's all they know. Right, for the majority of their career has been telework, and that change is going to drive some attrition. Next slide, please. So, as Rachel mentioned earlier, extending the Tax Cut and Jobs Act that was passed, during the first Trump administration is a high priority for the incoming administration. This Congressional Budget Office, scores that at roughly $4.5 trillion. Okay, that's a large amount of money. Okay, and there's a lot of provisions inside, the TCJA that will certainly be debated on, and there's new promises, campaign promises that were made that will add even further costs. And so, Congress and the new administration is going to be looking for ways, because certainly there are deficit hawks, in the party, they'll be looking for ways to find offsets in order to pass those tax cuts. Next slide, please. One thing that you have to think about is the grants and the awards that went to various agencies like DOT and EPA and DOE, those were certainly significant size grants and really monumental in terms of scale. However, tax credits, quote, cost the U.S. Treasury a lot more. Okay, and because tax credits are generally focused around deployment, and you have to think about where those tax credits went. And this is, I'm echoing something that Rachel was saying, is that a lot of these tax credits actually went to communities. Well, the reality is they went to communities all over the entire country, but about 80% of those tax credits actually went to communities that are in Republican states and or traditional battleground states. So a very significant amount of tax credits actually got distributed and deployed, in more traditional Republican states. And so when you think about that, there's going to be certainly fights and certainly fights by members of Congress in those areas to continue those tax credits. That said, I do believe that there's going to be some very significant changes. And the reason is the $4.5 trillion is a large sum of money. Okay, and they have to find ways to find some offsets to that. So next slide, please. So when you look at the size, that red box, on the outside is representing $4.5 trillion. The IRA tax credits is worth maybe 600 billion. Okay, a lot of money certainly, but not the entire amount. And so there's going to have to be other ways. So the IRA tax provisions are certainly part of the mix here, and certainly will need to be looked at. Next slide, please. So where this matters, okay, I think I've given at least 2 or 3 different talks to local governments across California and the nation in the last year or so. But you got to take advantage of the IRA elective or direct pay tax credits. The IRA made possible these tax credits for local governments, state governments, and even nonprofits for the first time ever. Okay, I filed for LA County's tax credits under the 3 most popular provisions: 48, 45W, and 30C. These are tax credits that allow you to deploy solar. Okay, we could have done that before, but through a third party, through power purchase agreements, and take advantage of the credits there. But commercial clean vehicle credits, 45W, as well as EV infrastructure or hydrogen fueling infrastructure. Those credits are the most common credits that local governments and nonprofits and state governments could take advantage of. In 2023, I filed it for LA County. It was about 220 something pages long, the tax filing. It's complex, but you got to do it. Okay. 2024 may be the last year, maybe 2025. Okay, so take advantage of it now, because if it goes away, it's likely to go away. At least the 45W, the EV tax credits. So please figure out how to do this. It is long and arduous, especially filing for the alternative fuel refueling property credits. There's a lot of paperwork involved. You have to keep track of, and you have to have records of payrolls and stuff like that. And so if you want the full credit, so that's a separate conversation, but you have to take advantage of this ASAP and file for the 2024, which is certainly safe, but 2025, depending on when they pass the reconciliation bill, and if they make it retroactive, that's certainly an area of concern. Next slide, please. And so when you look at overall the risk profile for the various tax credits, you look in I don't know if I can point here, but the EV tax credit, the 45W, is in the upper right-hand quadrant, and that's the most at risk. It's very costly. It scores roughly $100 billion. This is basically $7,500 that a consumer can receive for the purchase of a new EV, some additional on used EVs, but then also higher amounts for heavy duty, transportation vehicles. It's very costly to provide this type of credit because a lot of people are certainly buying a lot of vehicles. I think the country has made a lot of great progress in terms of electrifying the vehicle fleet in California. We've done a lot, right? We've invested not just federal monies, but also state monies in terms of EV infrastructure and zero emission vehicles. 1 out of 4 new light duty sedans in California is now an electric vehicle. So a lot of progress has been made. What I worry about is that if this particular provision gets repealed, then California will not be able to make the same level of progress that we have, or certainly won't be able to do that with additional investments. Other very costly tax credits, like the manufacturing tax credits, 45X, cost a lot of money. However, they tend to go towards Republican-leaning states like Georgia, Tennessee, the PTC, which is heavy on the wind side, benefits a lot of Midwestern states as well as Texas. And so I don't necessarily see those tax credits going away anytime soon. The other tax credits, will certainly be on the table as well, but it'll probably take a few years for those to play out. Next slide, please. But I will say that the uncertainty around tax credits are already having implications on current projects that are happening right now. LA County has a number of different solar projects going on. We've been working closely with our developers. They're already saying that there's additional risk involved in their projects that they have with us. And so just be on the lookout for that, and be aware that those changes are already having impact. Just the threat of those changes. Let me shift gears a little bit to the grant side. This is kind of a more high-level overview. I think Rachel did a great job giving you a more detailed background on some of the issues there. Make sure that you have award agreements signed, which is obligated before the new administration takes office. The awarded funding has already, if you were awarded, it's already been appropriated by Congress. The incoming administration will place an immediate moratorium, on all new grant awards, rules, and regulations. That will happen that night. The second they are, overseeing the agencies, that will happen. That does not mean that grant awards that have been announced or you've been notified will not be made. There's a good chance that those will continue to be made. There's going to be a review of, and that'll add some delay and uncertainty. Stick to the statement of work and other provisions of the grant award. The contract that you have with the federal government, generally speaking, the federal government does try to honor those things. But you have to live on to your side as well. Can't stress enough: execute, execute, and execute. Get it done. Spend that money. Make it less risky. The faster you spend it, the less there's risk also associated with that. But I want to go back to the point that I made earlier on the federal staffing. The federal staff overseeing awards, the people that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, they're going to be in flux. Some of those individuals are looking at new job opportunities, wherever it may be. You may see turnover in the people that you engage with on a regular basis. And that's going to create challenges. It's going to create delays. It doesn't necessarily kill things, but it will certainly create challenges that you will have to deal with on a award by award basis. Next slide, please. Lastly, don't expect any new grant opportunities. Grant programs that speak about climate change will be eliminated. In some cases, the focus on the work. The agencies will try to continue to do some of that work, and not focus on the why. Congress does appropriate dollars that agencies have to spend, and the why might change, but and the narrative might change, but progress on climate can still be made. You just don't need to talk about the climate change part of it. And if Trump 1 is a model for Trump 2, you got to remember that the president's budget request in the first administration zeroed out a lot of different things. The Energy Efficiency Renewable Energy Office at the DOE, the proposed president's budget was 70% less than it was, in prior years. EPA, like a third off. They just chopped a third off the agency, and some agencies were entirely eliminated. However, Congress, the president can propose a budget, but Congress is actually the appropriations arm of the federal government, and Congress did not pass the president's budget request in prior years. They made changes, significant changes. And for the most part, Congress doesn't make changes that rapidly. Okay, and so keep that in mind that it's usually tempered. You know, the stuff you hear on TV is usually tempered a little bit by what you actually see at the agency in the budget level. However, that was in a normal year. Okay. I believe that there will be some significant changes made. It'll take some fights in Congress, even though the House is, pretty closely or isn't strongly in one party. There's going to be some changes, certainly in budgets. Next slide, please. And I'll just end up here is use this opportunity to actually recruit and hire federal staff that are looking for new opportunities. I was in DC partly in December to try to find and recruit staff. Some of these individuals are, very technical. They understand how the federal government works. They understand like 10 CFR 600. They understand all the different regulations. It would benefit your community if you hired some of these individuals because they know the ins and outs. They know how things work. And so bring some of those individuals on if you have space, if you have opportunities and openings in your agencies to bring them on to your team because they will be very valuable. And then lastly, let's work together. There's still a lot of progress that we need to make. We're stronger as a collective. And so there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So please, let's work together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minh. Fantastic. Everybody should throw emojis at both of our amazing speakers today and spending all that time with us. We don't have a whole lot of time for discussion, but we do have our bonus breakout that will begin in just a few minutes for those of you that can hang around after, and we'll continue the conversation. And I'm interested in hearing a little bit more about your concerns and strategies related to federal funding. In the chat, while Minh's been talking, Rachel's been having a robust engagement here on tax credits, answering some questions. There's lots of uncertainty around tax credits. She has an analysis. She's going to figure out how to potentially share. We're talking about 2025 and can we bank on it? But I first wanted to ask Minh one question before we have to do one thing here at Seek before we close the formal session. You mentioned execute, execute, execute. And what Rachel was talking about too is about obligation. I'm wondering what I've been saying obligate, 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 right? So not just execute, but like one strategy that folks with awards could be using is to contract as quickly as possible to consider those funds obligated. Is that something you would suggest? And are you doing that? And what advice do you have?
Well, I mean, I think in all across the country, but certainly in California, we have processes that we have to follow in terms of government contracting, right? And so I think the bigger concern I would have is, if you already have a signed agreement with a federal agency, I think that the likelihood of that, being dramatically altered or canceled is pretty low. Okay, because for a number of different reasons. The next step is now the onus is on you to actually execute. Okay, there will be a drive towards if people deviate too far from what they said they were going to do, I think that opens up the opportunity for the federal agency to cancel or chop or do something with those awards. So that's why I'm saying execute, get your money spent, okay, and do what you said you were going to do. Okay, certainly there's going to be changes and things like that, but make sure that they're minimal. Any change is risky. And I also want to point out something that Rachel said earlier, which is around the weaponization of audits. It's going to happen. I spoke to a former Senate confirmed official who worked at the EPA under Trump 1, and there's already plans for it. So it's going to happen. You may not hear it right away because these audits do take time. Okay, but it's going to happen.
Man, that is such a bummer. I have to take out of my talking point. We haven't heard any signals for this.
All right, you guys, we're going to hand off to Kelsey for a minute just to give us an update on a Seek forum. Then we're going to turn our attention back to discussion, and I think we'll stick on the topic.
Yeah, super quick. Hopefully you already all know this already because you saw my emails, but if not, you should all submit session proposals for the Seek forum for 2025. Our deadline is February 7th, and we want to hear what projects you're working on. And that's it.
Yeah, share with us the best and brightest of what's going on around the state, because we get a lot of folks from even federal and state agencies that come and hear this, and we all want to see replication of the most successful things. So can't wait to see you there. It'll be in San Jose this year in July. Okay, next slide, please. We're going to close ourselves out for today. We'll be back on February 11th. If you have any ideas for things you want to hear about, this was so good. Let's give another round of applause for Minh and Rachel for being here. Really timely, really helpful. This is going to be interesting. LERN's going to be interesting. It's not going to be the windfall it's been. It's going to be something different and how we do more with what we have, which is still something here in California, thank God. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to our bonus breakout. And for those of you that can stick around, we always appreciate this extra 15 minutes time if we need it to have an informal discussion. And so we could just continue that conversation that we obviously needed a little bit more time on. Or if you have something else you want to share, an announcement, a success story, an opportunity, a need for information, collaborators, or advice, or you want to suggest something for a future LERN, that's what we end up talking about here. So for those of you who need to go, thank you so much.